and thank you for this opportunity to talk about Stevens and Williams. A slight problem, I suppose, to pack 200 years or nearly 200 years of history into a short time, but we'll do our best. The story starts with Huguenots, religious refugees from France, who came up into this country in waves in the 17th and 18th centuries. A number of them settled in Stourbridge, along the little river Stour, which was their source of transport. We're talking, of course, before canals. The Stour was good for heavy materials, clay, sand, and so on. And of course, they were families, as glassmaking has often been, and I'm conscious that this evening there are several families with us who've been in family glass businesses. It's interesting that we always refer to Stourbridge glass, or we often refer to Stourbridge glass. And of course, it's not Stourbridge glass, or very little of it, because the main glass factories were not in Stourbridge. They were in Amblecote and Wordsley, and Brierley Hill and Dudley. But the reason why Stourbridge, it was in Victorian days that the railway came to Stourbridge, and the London buyers came to Stourbridge by train, were picked up, from the station. And of course, it got known as Stourbridge glass by them, the buyers in London and elsewhere. So that name stuck. And so it was Stourbridge glass, even though actually there was very little made in Stourbridge. One of the factories that the Huguenots were connected with was Moore Street Glass Works on the edge of Brierley Hill, just on outskirts of Brierley Hill, on the hill down towards Pensnet and Wordsley. It belonged to a Colonel Atkinson, and it was rented, leased really, by my forebears, the Silvers family, in about 1820. There's no photo of Joseph Silvers, who was the tenant. Joseph Silvers was a nail maker from the Lye, near Stourbridge, near Dudley. But his wife, Anna Maria Silvers, had been a Stevens. She was born Stevens. So the Stevens family were one of these glass families. William Stevens, who became the Stevens of Stevens and Williams, was her nephew. And in fact, 4 of her daughters married into the Williams family, that's my family, and the Stevens family. So they were all very interconnected and to some extent interbred, I'm afraid. So the early years of that factory, which was from 1820 till about 1845, there's, as far as I know, only one record, which is this little floppy stock book. And all the records I'm referring to are in the Dudley archives. They've been lent by my family and elsewhere to the Dudley archives. And this is the stock book, and you see the list here, or a short list of some of the products. So if anyone can tell us what anticuculars are, we'd be delighted, because we don't know. Charles Heidemark doesn't know either. The other one I perhaps refer to, excisemen's inks. Well, of course, the excise tax was still in operation till, I think, 1845. And I like to think that at least we got something back from the dreaded excise by supplying them with ink bottles, because the ink they used was a special indelible ink for them to write out their license, I suppose, once you'd paid your duty, or the receipt or whatever. Anyway, we made the inks, and an intriguing item on the bottom, of course, urine bottles, and several of the items in this list are apothecary's glass, which was extremely important because the apothecary, as we know, was the first port of call if you were ill. And you needed to send one of the children down to the apothecary with a sample for him or, well, I guess it was a him, to come up with his opinion. So the partners, the original partners, took over when Joseph Silvers retired, and they were William Stevens on the left and Samuel Williams, my forebear, on the right. And they were the two sons-in-law of Joseph Silvers. And they set up together in 1846, and Stevens looked after the glass side, and Williams looked after the administration. Stevens, as I said before, was involved in glass in several other factories. Williams worked for the Earl of Dudley as a manager, in the sense, I'm sure that what he did was kept records of rents and went around collecting rents from the industrial tenants or mineral tenants, people who had mines. So the two of them joined together and started the business and worked together in the business at Moore Street. Now, William Stevens died in 1868. And it was that year that Samuel Williams started this diary. The diary still exists. I've had it conserved, and it's in Dudley archives. You can see its tiny waistcoat pocket diaries. You can see the pen on the right-hand side to show the scale, and tiny writing. And Samuel Williams kept that diary for a number of years, 14 years. And it's a very interesting history of sort of Black Country history, Stourbridge history, social history, and of course glass history. And some of it is in code. When he did his annual accounts every year, which are in the diary, I think that's the only place they are, he wrote the headings in code, his own personal shorthand code. And that was fairly common in those days. The banks also kept their ledgers in code. So that prying eyes didn't know exactly what they were looking at. So the diary is the source of much of this history. This is the membership certificate of the National Union of Flint Glass Workers, a very interesting trade union with its own history. It was one of the earliest trade unions. I think about 1840 it started. And it's written up, it's referred to by Sidney and Beatrice Webb in their writing about trade unions. And the original purpose was to protect traveling glassmakers. In the early days, before the industry settled down into fixed locations more, many of the glassmakers went around with their specialist skill, making glass wherever they could. So you needed some jugs making. You got hold of Jim, who made jugs, and he would come along perhaps from somewhere else altogether, Birmingham or somewhere else, to make your jugs. So the union was an independent and proud union. It believed that the glassmakers were the aristocrats of craftsmen, which I believe as well, of course. And they were good to deal with. There were extremely difficult times in the late 1880s and the turn of the century, where I'm not proud to say that industrial relations were not at all good. And my own feeling is that the glassmakers, having been at the top of the tree as far as earnings were concerned for many years, saw the other local industries, engineering, foundries, steelworks and so on, coming up and perhaps taking their place. And obviously they weren't happy about that. My great-grandfather, Joseph Williams, joined the firm in 1864 as a very young man. And I should have mentioned that the diary records that in about 1868, when Joe was more or less 21, there was serious subsidence at the Moore Street factory. And Samuel Williams decided to move. It was impossible for him to carry on in this rented property. So he started looking for a new site. And he looked at several sites in the Pensnet, Brierley Hill area. And he settled on the site just across the canal, which by then had been built. And in fact, the railway had been built as well, because the railway came up through Brierley Hill in I think, 1852. So he hopped over there and bought a site, again owned by Colonel Atkinson, as it happened, and where he could build a new factory for his son, Joe. Because his partner had died, he was intent on carrying the business on his own, and he was intent really on creating a brand new factory for his son. So the early years of the diary, the first 2 or 3 years of the diary, are detailed records of his move from Moore Street across to North Street, which didn't actually exist in those days, but he hopped over the canal on the railway line. It's right to mention John Northwood at this stage because John Northwood, who at this stage in the early 1850s, 60s, had his own business in Worsley. He was a close collaborator of Samuel Cox Williams. He is mentioned in the diary very early on, right from day one. The archives of the firm show that he was supplying the company, or the partnership, in the early 1850s with small amounts of engraving, and that amount gradually builds, so that as time goes on, John Northwood does more and more for Stevens and Williams. He obviously works for other firms as well, but he did have a special relationship with Samuel Williams. For instance, this man, Edwin Grice, who is here, one of the principal engravers, lived in a house owned by Samuel Williams, because the diary shows Williams collecting rent from Northwood on behalf of Edwin Grice. So the new factory was built by about 1870, and that is the site that was occupied until the late 1990s. The new works, and that's an early photograph of it. And we can see here, I think you can see my cursor, glass house, obviously, with the chimneys. That was the steam engine shed, and the cutting shops, which were down here and here, were driven by belts which went through the roofs of all these other buildings, because as far as I know, that was the only steam engine, and it drove cutting shop belts in the rest of the factory. The house here is Honeybourne House, before being altered for John Northwood. When John Northwood finally joined us in the early 1880s, this house was extended radically to provide better accommodation for him. And this rough ground in front was made into a nice garden for John Northwood. Now, the marriage between Joe and Annette Thomas was very important for the family, and actually also for the business, because Annette's father, Thomas Davis Thomas, was the general manager and a major shareholder in the Stourbridge and Kidderminster Bank, which was quite an important local bank, with offices in places like Upton-on-Severn, Bewdley, Kidderminster, and in fact it had one in Chipping Norton, because the Tweed mill, or woolen mill at Chipping Norton, was owned by a major shareholder, so there was a branch there as well. But the point really was that, of course, Annette's inheritance in due course was very helpful to the family, particularly in the dirty 30s and the 20s, when time was extremely difficult. And as a result of the marriage, Joseph here changed his name to, on his father-in-law's death to Williams Thomas. So that's where the complicated amalgamation of Williams and Thomas come from. This is T.D. Thomas, the manager, or the general manager of the bank. He had his portrait painted when he retired, or the shareholders had his portrait painted when he retired. And I have the original of that, or at least my son Sam does, in London. The diary records many things, social events as well as business things. And in about the mid-70s, Samuel Cox Williams' younger son, James, qualified as a lawyer. And the whole family went down to London and had several days gallivanting around in London, doing all the things one did, including lots of drinking and all the rest of it. And what they all did together on one occasion was to go to Osler's showroom and to look in the window, or maybe it was inside, at this new fountain which had been made for the Maharaja of Patiala. And the reason Sam records that in his diary is that we had made many of the components. Just as David Wilkinson, in his very interesting talk recently, told us how he made components for Osler restorations. we made components for Osler originals. And I know that that was that's the reason the family went to see that fountain. Quite extraordinary thing. Now we move to some of our craftsmen and artists. And this is Tom Cartwright, who was one of the most long-serving top glassmakers. Of course, cameo in the 1880s was a very important area of our production. And this shows Tom warming in a very large gather in the reheating furnace, which it's called in the trade a glory hole. And he's warming it in, and there was lots of reheating. Having gathered, the metal had to be brought back to the right temperature. And of course, skilled men would pull bubbles out with their pincers and warm in again and so on until it was exactly ready to be made and handled. And of course, it's such a large gather because there are so many gathers and picked up colors. Here we have Josh Hodgetts, one of the top craftsmen, both in intaglio work and in engraving. Engraving, of course, under the wheel, which is what he's doing here. And it's quite interesting to see the flywheel up above his head and the belt driving the engraving lathe and the hopper of slurry up in front of him, up on the wall, and a bit of tubing coming down. And of course, he's engraving under the wheel, and intaglio work would very often be over the wheel using a natural stone, giving you fluidity of cutting, which you can't get with a large diamond wheel. And on the right, we've got one of the cameo vases actually designed by Will Northwood, but carved by Josh Hodgetts. And all these pieces of cameo that I'm showing now are in the Dudley collection on long-term loan to the new Stourbridge Glass Museum. And shortly, we'll be able to see them again in all their glory, we hope. Examples of, here we have intaglio work through casing, a little bit later than the 1880s probably, and a variety of designs, all floral designs. Of course, intaglio is particularly appropriate for floral designs. And Stevens and Williams, which later became Royal Brierley, majored on these floral designs. And we came into our own again in the 70s, 80s, and 90s when the Japanese were very keen on our floral designs, and our intaglio work came into its own, which we just kept going through the years. Some more cameo, all of these pieces, of course, in the collection, designed by, all of them designed by Will Northwood, I think. And all of them very valuable. I actually bought the left-hand bluebird vase at Sotheby's in the 70s for our own collection. It was then sold and fortunately found its way back to us through the purchasing policy of Dudley Council, which was very, very fortunate. But other than that, a number of these cameo vases were given or bequeathed by John Northwood II out of his collection, and my grandfather, Hubert Silvers Williams Thomas, from his own personal collection. So we've seen some very large cameo pieces, which weren't really, I mean, yes, they were commercial, but they were really sort of icons of the trade. We also made a vast quantity of much smaller cameo pieces, collector's pieces, dressing table pieces. This is a small piece from my own collection. It's only 3 inches tall. A little smelling salts bottle with its little stopper inside, and so on. Victorian ladies had these cabinets with glass-fronted cabinets, which they filled with little collector's pieces, and we were happy to make those. Now, much of the cameo has the bulk of the overlay etched out with acid, and this is the etching department in about 1890. A group of young ladies ruled over by Miss Lawley, who was in charge of that department. Miss Lawley was also John Northwood's housekeeper at Honeybourne. And they were very important because this department was really the mainstay. Well, it was, you know, it was the foundation of cameo work. The background had to be removed before further work could be done. It was also a very messy process. Another craftsman, and more than a craftsman, Frederick Carder. Many of you, of course, will know the story of Fred Carder. He joined us just before John Northwood, in fact, and was such a talented artist and craftsman. The sad thing was that he was overlooked and passed over for John Northwood's job when he died. His son, John Northwood II, became art director rather than Fred Carder. And Fred Carder, somewhat understandably, took himself off to America in 1903, where he founded Steuben Glass. My family were always very sore about it. My grandfather used to talk about it to me when I was 19 or 20. My grandfather would tell me the story about how the Stourbridge industry, combined with Staffordshire County Council, had sent Carder out to survey the American industry. And on our behalf as well, he went to visit Hawkes, who were major customers for blanks. Hawkes were a cutting shop in those days, and Carder went out, obviously met Hawkes, and was attracted by their offer and stayed. He came back, in fact, to fetch his family, but he went back and founded Steuben, which later became part of Corning, and we all know what a famous business that was. And we suffered because he took many of our techniques, which he changed slightly and called by different names. He also attracted some of our glassmakers, but that's another story, which I know James Riesel is currently researching, and it's an extremely interesting story. And it happened to coincide with a very difficult period for industrial relations back in the UK. And I think Carder was able to capitalize on that. A lot of glassmakers were fed up with the aggro and took themselves off to America. But I had the pleasure of actually meeting Fred Carder, the privilege and pleasure. I was a young chap out there for a kind of an internship as a kind of gap year before I went to university. And I was taken to meet Fred Carder at Corning. And it was amazing because I think he was 98. I was very naive. I wasn't really in the business, although I kind of knew about it and I had been briefed. But there I was, faced by him with all his history, looking at me with his bushy moustache and his brown cow coat. That's what we call them in the factory, these cow coats that Sue Foreman wore. And he looked at me and said, "Which one are you then?" in a broad black country American accent. And I had to explain because, you know, he hadn't met a Williams Thomas since he'd left, which was 50 years before, 55 years before. So anyway, he softened and we had a nice conversation. And I really am, you know, I'm very privileged to have met him. Rock crystal was one of Stevens & Williams's big manufacturing lines. The attraction for the company was that it used every skill on the ground. Heavy cutting, intaglio cutting, diamond cutting, pillar cutting, engraving, almost everything you can think of except casing. And therefore, it also covered all the defects in the blanks. So that was a great joy. Of course, there weren't many defects, were there? But just in case there was one, it could be covered. Again, John Northwood, who joined us in about 1882, to much acclamation from particularly the cutting shops. They had a special dinner for him to welcome him. And of course, his impact was tremendous. He was a maestro as far as both glasshouse and cutting shop decoration were concerned. And he was a marvelous asset for the firm. And he moved to Honeybourne House and became a very important part of the business, obviously. My grandfather joined the business in 1896, and he had the burden of carrying the business really through the First and Second World Wars, because my father went to the Second War, and my grandfather, with John Northwood's help and Percy Scriven and others, but he and his wife, who was extremely important behind the scenes, carried the business really through those two wars. Before the First World War, we recognized, or it was recognized in this country, that there was a shortage of glass for lighting. Gas lighting was becoming widespread, obviously. Electric lighting was just beginning. And you still had oil lamps and candles in some places. And all that lighting glass came from abroad, France and Germany, Czechoslovakia. So I think the government assisted this, and I'm not quite sure how that was arranged, but it's apocryphal news that there was some government money involved, but they sponsored several factories, Halewood and Ackroyd up in Yorkshire, Chance Brothers in Birmingham, ourselves, and Webbs in London were all set up to make glass for the lighting industry. And that was a useful and successful business for many years. The First World War came all too quickly. We turned over to war work, which in those days would have been really replacing technical glass and utility tableware, which would have come from the continent, because presumably those supplies would have dried up. So we would have made glass for medical purposes, chemical purposes, and so on. But the other effect of the war, of course, was that skills were hit. Men didn't come back, and it was all men. And the social changes that resulted. Women took over many of the jobs, which was wonderful, and that changed their status in society. And of course, the sort of first stages of major societal changes happened as a result of the First World War. We made what actually Charles Heidemark has called patriotic glassware. On the left here, we've got a chalice engraved. I'm not sure whether this is in memory of a man who didn't come back or whether it was given to a man who did come back, but we made these for all the soldiers involved in the First World War. It's worth just looking at this chalice because, of course, it is made as a fully handmade large-size wine glass or goblet. And here we've got a fully hand-formed bowl that has never touched a mold, a maurice, a hollow stem, another little formed length of glass, another maurice, and a blown foot. And those of you who have very old or Victorian glasses in the back of your cupboards will know those very lovely light feet. Those are all blown feet, or most of them. They will be blown feet. And that is where a bubble of glass is made, which is then stuck up to a maurice, knocked off, rewarmed, opened up, sheared, and a foot made. So what I'm really trying to say is that these handmade glasses, wine glasses, were incredibly expensive and slow to make. You take a team would have made, I think, probably about 30 or 40 of these chalices in a day. I'll come back to that later. The other glass on the right is a patriotic glass with enameled flags of the Allies. But again, you see here the exotic glass-making techniques used at that time still. We've got a bubble enclosed in the base of the bowl. We've got, I think, an air twist stem. And I think we've got here a blown foot, but I think it may be a rolled foot, and the same here. Cameo carried on in the early 1900s, but in a simpler form, in more of an arts and crafts form, and obviously to meet the chinoiserie fashion. But after the First World War, design trends started to change. And we felt the impact of that, along with other major changes in the 20s and 30s, which of course the whole of society was subject to. The carriage trade, which is the very specialist trade of families, corporations, companies, shipping lines, having their own products, their exclusive products, which were designed in conjunction with them and made only for them. Frequently, wine glasses would be made for one customer exclusively. In the 20s and 30s, we didn't really make for stock and supply X stock. But the political and societal effects and influences were very strong too. Hunger marches, the miners' strike, the Wall Street crash, and so on. But we had a cheerful day in 1925 when there was a royal visit to the area to really try to improve morale in industry. And here we have my great-grandfather, Joe Williams, wearing his OBE, and he is taking the Duchess of York, who of course became the Queen and the Queen Mother, and the Duke of York, George VI, back up the drive after the visit. And they're all being applauded, of course, by all the staff who are on a lovely day by the look of it. And I think with the Duke is the Earl of Dudley, because the other factory they visited in Brierley Hill was the Round Oak Steel Works, which was owned by the Earl of Dudley, and I suspect that is him. And behind we can see the new factory, which had been in operation for about 45 years since Joe had built it, which of course is now lovely apartments. So if you would like a nice apartment in Brierley Hill, and if there is one available, those are extremely nice accommodation. Also in 1925, as a gesture of confidence, we built a new furnace, a new pot furnace, to a brand new design. This was a pot furnace fired on producer gas. And the reason for that would have been cleanliness in the glass house. Before that, we would have charged coal directly into the base of the furnace with constant feeding of, shoveling coal in. And that was very dusty, and it resulted in dust in the glass house, which, as any glassmaker will tell you, if you get dust on your marva, you're going to get a blister. So the new furnace would have helped that, and it would have been more economical as well. And here in this photo, we see my father, Reg Williams Thomas, bending down to light the new furnace. It was traditional for the youngest member of the family to actually light a new furnace, because the theory was that they would see the most life out of it and would sort of live to see it come to fruition, hopefully. So this is Joe looking somewhat credulously at the camera. John Northwood II here, Joe's family, his wife and daughters here, and various employees, some of whom, this is Gilbert Hill, who worked with me for many years, was a very young man. My father joined the business in 1933 from Birmingham University, and of course, he joined at a time when things were extremely difficult with the Depression, and also there were major changes in design taste. And we were moving into the Art Deco period, which was a completely new direction for the firm. Our strength was in decoration, both in the glass house and in cutting. And the new trend for very plain glassware in simple pastel colors was difficult for us. It was like trying to change the direction of travel of the Queen Mary. And during that period, we were in touch, or Joe was in touch with Gordon Russell. The Russell family owned the Ligon Arms Hotel in Broadway in Worcestershire, not far from where I live. And Gordon Russell, as many of you will know, became an architect and also an industrial designer. His design work included chairing the committee that designed the utility ranges during the Second War. As the family owned the Ligon Arms, he designed new glassware for that hotel. And there was correspondence between Gordon Russell and Joe Williams. And the letter from Gordon Russell is absolutely scathing about our design and about our design policy. It's somewhat embarrassing, really, because clearly Joe had asked his advice. I think they'd met socially. And Joe asked his advice, what can we do about our design? How do we meet this new challenge of the Art Deco look? And Gordon Russell came back, and it's all in the archives, saying that Joe should treat his designers with some respect. He should not treat them and pay them like clerks, and that our designs are pastiches of the worst kind. And I think Joe would have been mortally offended and wouldn't have had a clue how to respond to that. But of course, what Joe didn't know was that Gordon Russell was in the very first wave of, if you like, professional design. And Keith Murray, who did work for us intensively, was also an architect, again short of work in the dirty 30s, although he did design the new factory at Barlaston for Wedgwood. But he designed many pieces for us, which have since become important collector's pieces, because although he designed probably several thousand pieces, and there is a description book which lists them all, very few were actually made and sold. So they're important collector's pieces. World War II came all too soon, and that heralded yet another complete business transformation. During the war, we switched to war work. We made radar tubes, we made aircraft landing lights, we made chemical and medical glassware, and so on. But after the war, we came back, and my father came back from the war, having had a distinguished, having served with distinction in the war, came back and really had to start again from scratch. It was like starting a new business. We spent money on relaying out parts of the factory. New products were developed, and one of the worst aspects of the post-war period was national service, which continued from about 1949, I think, up to 1962. Quite why it was necessary to go on so long, I just don't understand, but it was very damaging for industrial training, because in those days the school leaving age was 15, and that meant that a young chap joining us, and it was all chaps, or not chapesses, they would join us and join the apprenticeship, which was a legal process in those days. They signed indentures, and that would be like a 6 or 7 year training up through the chair. And that was broken into by national service when they became 17. They'd go away to the army or navy or whatever, and they'd learn another trade, maybe a mechanic or radio operator, or I don't know, lorry driver, something else. And they wouldn't necessarily come back to us. New products were essential, and Reg introduced the first real retail catalogue that we had ever produced. I've got a copy of this, and it's hard-backed, it's foolscap size, it's gold blocked with the royal arms of the royal warrant of King George VI here, and the use of the brand name. We were starting to see more intensive use of the Royal Bradley Crystal name. It was a bit confusing because the company was called Stevens and Williams, and that had, quite a historical tradition. But we were very well aware that the brand was also becoming important, and products at this stage were often marked both, either or both, S&W or Royal Bradley Crystal. We weren't quite sure which way to jump. Joe had become aware of this because he was also director of Royal Worcester. And of course, Worcester were well aware of the brand implications. So that is the catalogue, and that was for products which would be produced for stock. So here we see a group of handmade glasses. I'm going back a little bit. These were Edwardian glasses, but I've got them here to show you again the range of different stems that could be made. These are all the same bowl, or more or less the same bowl, not quite. And I remember on my grandfather's Christmas table, there would often be an assembly of these glasses, different colors. They were happy to mix them, different sizes, different cuts, different colors. and different stems. I mean, they've all got multiple marises, the hollow stems. That's a hollow stem, I think. Colored stems, and of course, all handmade. So with many glassmaking processes and very expensive. But after the war, that wasn't appropriate. So we made what we started to introduce what we called new process wines, which meant the top was just cut off cold in the new process department. So this is blown, the bowl is blown in a mold. The stem and foot are put on a single gob of glass here. Excuse me while I just refresh my voice. That's better, thank you. And a gob of glass for the foot. And basically 3 operations in the glass house instead of what could be 9 or 10. So a much cheaper product. Many more made in the shift. If you take, this is our Bruges sherry, and our best wine servitors would, in a day, would probably make about 120 to 150 of those. Whereas if you take a handmade wine of a, well, they wouldn't be that small, but a similar handmade wine, it would be very much less, perhaps 50 or 60 in the day. 2 of the most popular wine suites which resulted from the new product development after the war, the honeysuckle design, which is intaglio, which we carried on making, and the Gainsborough design, which was produced to compete with Waterford, a longer stem and a cut stem and a larger bowl. The new process department introduced after the war, and this is the department that actually did the processing of the tops of the wines. So we've got, I'm not sure how many, but probably 40 or 50 operatives here, a belt down the middle with the product going down the belt, cracking off and grinding and various other activities down the belt. And what we see here, and this was laid out by my father, is fluorescent lighting, which was very new in those days. It was a new thing. So after the war, I think this was a thank you to the older staff, directors and so on, who'd kept the business going through the war. And here we've got John Northwood II and his wife here, Percy Scriven over here, and the Scriven family were very close friends of the family and had been involved in the business since the 1840s. And his wife. Down below here, you've got somebody whose name I won't mention, but perhaps you can guess who that is. He's a little bit older today and sitting here in this chair that I'm sitting in. I mentioned John Northwood the first. That's his son, Ken Northwood, who worked with us for a while until the middle 60s. My grandfather up here and my father down below somewhere here, but just back from the war. Design was a crucial feature after the war. My father was intent on becoming a design-led company, and Tom Jones was our, if you like, our staff designer who was with us for many, many years and designed many new products. And this is one of the 1950s products showing intaglio work again, the rose design. Diane Meanley, who trained at the Stourbridge College of Art. I don't have records of what Diane did afterwards. She was with us for a few years in the early 50s and designed very appropriate, typical 1950s designs. This reminds me so much of the Festival of Britain and those kind of designs, the Sky Lawn and all the rest of it. And again, the Royal Brierley Crystal logo is beginning to come in. Constance Spry, a fashionable flower arranger, helped us design a number of flower arranging vases. These were less expensive because they didn't need to be cut with the optic molding. And of course, the molding hid the stems of the flowers. A wonderful day in 1957 when, as part of the post-coronation tour, the Queen visited many industries in the area and came to see us with Prince Philip. And as my son Sam pointed out to me yesterday, not much sign of protective clothing and high vis. Here is the Queen chatting to Horace Bullock, one of our top craftsmen, obviously, as they say, sharing a joke. And Horace was then in his 70s, I think, and overlapped with me. He worked for at least 5 years after I'd started in the early 60s, and he was then one of our tour guides. So a new decade in the 1960s. We've got many icons of the 60s, which I'm sure many of us remember, the Mini as well as the mini skirt. But as far as the business was concerned, Waterford Crystal, which came along after the war, supported by the Irish Glass Bottle Company, the McGrath family, and very much supported by the Irish government, was not only, I'm sure they expanded the market with their advertising, but their heavy advertising in America and in Canada and in Australia, which are all our classic export markets then, were serious competition to all of us, the whole industry. And Waterford were always the elephant in the room. They were really the competition. We didn't really consider each other in the Stourbridge area. Our common issue really was Waterford. We also saw Dartington, Caithness, Kings Lynn, Cumbria coming along. Stewart's opened their factory in Wales at around the same time. Factory shops became important, much opposed by our own sales team because they saw it as undermining our retail sales, but it was a very valuable cash outlet. Reg, my father, Reg Williams-Thomas, was very keen to promote the idea of wedding lists with our retail customers. This was an American idea originally. The China trade picked it up and we picked it up as well. Persuade retailers to keep wedding lists for their customers so that families would collect their pattern. And this definitely took off. As crystal was seen as a slightly less expensive present than silver. There were many china and glass shops throughout the country, many independents. A lot of jewelers sold crystal. There were chains. Lawley's was widespread, as was Chinacraft in the London area, was coming along. And we had a force of representatives of, I think, 4 in those days, plus a sales director and most of the directors who did sales jobs as well. We promoted English full-lead crystal at this time. Whether that was wise in retrospect is an open question. But we wanted to differentiate ourselves from the imported crystal, which was lower than 30% lead. The 30% lead gave us the advantage of higher weight, better refractive index, more brilliance in the cutting. But to be honest, as time went on, it wasn't really noticeable, especially as some of the imports became such good quality with a much lower lead content. In the early 1960s, national service finished, and we moved to formal training schemes for young people. And things looked up on the training side when industrial training boards came in. And we took advantage of that and developed our own industry-wide youth training schemes. Another 60s icon, Conran became extremely important, and I'm sure many of us remember that. The interesting thing is that it was very much the younger people who were attracted by Habitat. It was the Mary Quant generation. And Terence Conran himself, you know, and my generation, who were very attracted by Habitat. Our parents and grandparents still drank plenty of port and sherry glasses, cut port and sherry glasses still sold, despite Habitat. So the 1970s, another new decade, quite difficult in many respects. There was political and economic turbulence, prices and incomes control, and all sorts of strange things going on. Concession shops developed and factory shops. But one of the most important things that I'm proud of is that we collaborated with the Studio Glass movement. I enjoyed this. I enjoyed their products, and the Stourbridge College of Art was very prominent in training studio glass people, as was, well, Wolverhampton, I don't think had really started because Wolverhampton succeeded Stourbridge, but Stourbridge was very important. And we would, for a number of years in the 60s, the 70s, open our furnaces during our work shutdown for several days of studio working. This meant that the studio craftsmen had plenty of glass to go at and plenty of company. And our work social club was open for them in the evening, and we had many happy times, which I remember with great pleasure. That went on for many, well, I say many years, probably 4 or 5 years, and was eventually picked up by Dudley Council and supported by Dudley Council. And it became more of an industry-wide, Broadfield House became involved, and it became more of an industry-wide event. And later, of course, became the Dudley Glass Festival, which still exists and goes on and will be happening next year. We also had the arrival of natural gas, which was very beneficial because it was much cleaner and softer and more and kinder to furnaces. And both factories were more profitable towards the end of that period. We also had a visit from Princess Margaret, who came with Lord Snowdon, representing the Council of Industrial Design. We had a somewhat tricky relationship with the Council of Industrial Design. They did approve one of our designs, but on the whole, we took the view that our customers liked our designs better than they liked the Council of Industrial Design's approved designs. But perhaps I won't go further than that. In 1972, my father, Reg, became master of the Glass Sellers Company. And this photo shows him and his wardens. And you'll recognize on the right of the photo our sadly recently departed past master and father of the company, Michael Nathan. 1980s, another new decade, after a tricky start when Mrs. Thatcher came in, because she tightened money supply, and there was actually quite a serious depression in the very early days of the 1980s, which was not good. And any factory like a glass factory, which needs continuous production, does not like having to mess around with short-time working and redundancies and so on. It is not good for production. But having got through that, things improved. There was much more stability and more profitability throughout. The lighting glass factory came on stream with better profits. We had good relationships with the chain stores. British Home Stores and Woolworths were large retailers of glass lampshades. And we were major suppliers, if not the only supplier eventually, to both of them. Rather dependent on them, but we were. We also moved to a 24% lead content without telling the customers, without saying a word, and nobody noticed anything. And it was much easier to melt, better quality, easier to acid polish. And we changed the company name to Royal Brierley Crystal to try to minimize confusion. Exports improved. Our markets in Japan and America became much better, and the 80s generally were much more profitable times. We were able to invest in the business. The Japanese stores, our most important in terms of volume was Daimaru, which head office in Osaka. We also dealt with Takashimaya, Mitsukoshi, and others. And we had a particular way of dealing with them whereby we manufactured special ranges for each one, so they weren't in direct competition on price. But in 1982, we could see that the lighting glass factory was very dependent on a few customers, and we looked for alternative products for that factory. And we asked Gwyneth Newland, who had recently come from the Royal College of Art, to design ranges of new products, which you see here in front of her. Frosted, I think this was acid frosted. I think it may have been sprayed, I'm not sure. Hurricane lamps, little vases and candle lamps and carafes. And these were launched, very attractive. They had their own packaging and a new kind of sub-brand name, the Studio range. And they were launched at Harrogate in, I think, 1984 or 85. And unfortunately, they didn't sell as well as they should have done. And on reflection, I think the market was well satisfied with what it already had. But we made a valiant effort to diversify in the lighting glass factory. And those products were made in 24% lead. Again, in 1985, we had a lovely visit from Princess Diana, who was just starting to do her own engagements. She was welcomed on the Marsh and Baxter's sports field by lots and lots of children. She came in a helicopter, was very exciting for Brierley Hill, and spent a lot of time with us, and we enjoyed that, and so did the works. The royal warrants, which we held, we were very proud of holding, and we held the monarch's warrant from George V onwards. We actually supplied Queen Victoria, but in those days nobody bothered too much about official royal warrants. But we held a warrant continuously through all the monarchs up to the present Queen. And once we started supplying Kensington Palace, we were granted a warrant for the Prince of Wales as well. And of course, the royal warrant, as David Wilkinson told us in his lovely talk, is granted to a person, not to the company, because the royal household likes to have relationships with a person, and that person is usually the head of the firm, whoever that is. And I used to go to both Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace quite often to make sure everything was okay. Maybe just a courtesy call. Do you have everything you need? Just a chat. And in the case of Buckingham Palace, it was a traipse upstairs to the pantry, which was not the sort of pantry that you and I would have, even if we have a pantry, but was a suite of rooms in the back of the house. With lots and lots of cupboards and very valuable glassware going back to Georgian times. I was fascinated just to have a look in those cupboards to see what they'd got. I remember being up there. Our direct contact was the yeoman of the pantry. That was his official title. And I remember being with him one day, chatting away, and there on the draining board was this very valuable French China dinner service. I don't know how valuable it was. It should have been obviously in a museum, but it wasn't, because it was in Buckingham Palace. And it was being dried with hair dryers. Everything like that was dried with a hair dryer, because a towel or anything else would take a tiny bit of gold off. And there were lovely things that went with being a warrant holder. I remember once our designers got involved in a project. I forget exactly what it was. It was a special design project, presentation piece, I think, and they were invited down to join in, to be in a staff gallery during a state banquet, I think at Windsor. And this was, a privilege. Please come down, and with the staff, you can see the table when it's laid before the people come in, which of course is astounding, and you can watch the service if you'd like to, and that's what they did. And I remember a garden party, I think it was the centenary of the Royal Warrant Holders Association, and the Queen gave a garden party specially for warrant holders. And she does have this soft spot, as David said, for her tradesmen, and knows them, and knows who they are. We had a surprise visit in 1987 from the Prime Minister. I think an election was on the horizon, and one of the Dudley seats was a bit marginal, so along she came. But somewhat to my surprise, she had a very warm welcome in the factory, and came round. But what I didn't obviously she did have bigger things to think about, as well as Royal Brierley. And one of the issues she had was the reconciliation, if you call it that, or the change in relationship between East and West. Here's Ronnie Reagan, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down that wall. And there were big changes on the horizon, which would have a big effect on us. And in 1989, the wall did come down. And what did that mean? It meant that eventually the Eastern Bloc factories were able to produce nice crystal, very high quality, because that's what they made, the Czechs, the Slovenians, and the rest. And they were very skilled and very good engineers, and always had been. But of course, they made that all-over cut material that was supplied prior to the wall coming down, which was organized by the Russian 5-year plan. But once they could start to make nice things, they started to become serious competition. So the 1990s started with some difficult things, really. We joined the ERM, which took the exchange rate mechanism for a short time, which took the pound far too strong, and export sales were hit really badly. We had to close the lighting glass factory, sadly, in the early 1990s. Again, events beyond our control. The halogen lighting was coming in. New houses were not being built with the central rows. Gradually, we could see that the market for the decorated glass lampshades was going to diminish, and we needed a certain level of sales to make the business viable. Bottom line, we had quite a high cost business model, because even our labor cost was a fixed cost in the short term. Changes in public taste, entertaining habits changed, the Eastern European factories I've mentioned. Waterford posted some big losses in that period, which really scared the banks. And by the late 1990s, the whole tableware business could see that changes were on the horizon. This took time to work through, but it takes us to where we are today. So today we have the Stourbridge Glass Museum, which is nearly ready for you to come and visit. The expected opening date is April next year. There's a wonderful team in place. Here you see its manifesto, if you like, the Stourbridge Glass Museum at the heart of the community, with globally significant collections to educate and inspire. It will be a national destination for us to be proud of. It will be the focus for local and national glass heritage. It will be a valuable and important inward visitor destination, and many other things as well. It will give heart to the whole glass trade, whether it's the studio movement or the engravers and cutters who are in the area. It will provide a focus and will be immensely valuable. Here we see the part of the original team, a very important part of the original team who got involved from day one. We're talking about now, I was looking earlier today, it's about 12 years ago that it was first announced that the museum, that Broadfield House would be closed. That date was then postponed to 2015. But Graham Knowles here has been at the heart of all this effort, and with all his support in so many different ways, which he'd be embarrassed if I listed them. But he has supported us in so many different ways. And Graham is chairman of the trust, which is backing the new museum. And Lynn Boleyn, who's amongst us today, has been our administrative secretary and has really run the show from a practical point of view from the beginning. And here we've got Alistair Malcolm, we all know, who's an honorary liveryman. And Dudley Council, represented here, has been behind us all the way, and we're incredibly grateful to Dudley Council for that. The glass sellers have been supporting the museum, and the museum is incredibly grateful for that. Here is the Stuart Crystal sign, which the Glass Sellers Company has paid for to be refurbished. And here, finally, we make the full circle. Here is the Stevens and Williams trade plate, going back to the 1920s, I think. And it's quite amusing. It's pointed out to me yesterday that at the very bottom here, of course, we had London offices and showrooms in Holborn Viaduct. We had a full staff down there. And at the bottom, we say our speciality is in cheap and effective lines, as well as high-class ones. I don't think we use that as a sales line today. And so, as I say here, I feel so privileged to have had all those years with such a fine group of people, and we'll look back to it, look back on it with great fondness. If you want to read a bit more about the industry, you've got Charles's books, of course, which I'm sure you all know. The splendid book by Jason Ellis, which is a detailed history of each factory, and my own book on the history of Stevens and Williams, based on the diary. So thank you very much for listening, and I think that's the end of what I have to say. And thank you for tolerating. I'm sorry I've gone on rather a long time. I'm appalled by the length of time I've gone on, but thank you for listening for so long.
If you can unshare your screen, David.
Stop sharing.
We have a couple of messages that came through, David. One was from one or two from Catherine Coleman.
Yes.
She said she didn't think it was anticular glass. It was more likely anti-jugular glass, which was a medical instrument.
Oh, how brilliant. Oh, that's
right.
Excellent. Oh, I'm so delighted to know that. I'll have to go back to the little black book and see if I can decipher the writing. It's all in, you know, archaic handwriting, so we've obviously got it wrong.
So anti-jugular.
Jugular. It's something to do with blood pressure. If you look it up online, you'll find more about it.
Oh, that's wonderful, Catherine. Thank you very much. It's a frightfully important thing to know, isn't it?
And then she further went on to say that Joshua Hodgetts was using a stone wheel, and
Yes.
therefore the hopper is a holding water.
Ah, yes, quite right.
And
Absolutely
then
right.
if it was a grit stroke emery, the wheel would have a leather tongue.
Quite right. She
And the
spotted that. I knew she would. She put me right.
Pick of Carder shows a lathe, but it's not an engraving lathe. It's a wood-turning lathe and no place for spindle.
Oh, good. Oh, I've learned so much. That's really helpful.
Right.
Thank you so much.
The person who was doing the research on Carder, was that Mr. Meisel?
Yes.
James Beazle, yes.
Sally Hayden wanted to know that.
Yep. Sally and I are friends. I'll get in touch with her.
Thank you very much indeed, James. And his influence on the flow of men, including of my ancestors, the Custer, went there from Worsley in 1882, and I'd like to find out more.
Chatting away about work, so.
Cynthia Williams says, is there any record of engraver Fridolin, Kreischmann, later of Thomas Webb, and then in the US with Lois T. Tiffany, employed Stephen
chatting in the background.
Words about what she'd been doing in the lab, and she never hesitated.
I think we need to mute.
Yes, I've just muted the person concerned.
Yeah, that's better. Would you mind saying that quickly again?
Is there any record of an engraver, Fridolin Kreischmann, later of Thomas Webb, and then in the US with Louis C. Tiffany, employed at Stevens and Williams circa 1879?
I'll have a look in the diary. I'm not aware of it, but what used to happen occasionally was that these craftsmen were subcontractors. They weren't necessarily employed. They would work independently and would be used. And I honestly can't remember the name. I don't think so, because I think I would recognize it, but I will have another look.
That was a Cynthia Williams asked that.
Thank you. Thank you.
I've studied the Stevens and Williams records for years, and I've never come across Friedlin Kretschmann at Stevens and Williams.
No.
But the records don't rarely, they show Joshua Hodgetts, they show John Orchard and Erard and people like that, but it's very rare that they actually put the name of the actual artisan that might have been working on it, other than those big ones. So Joshua Hodgetts would have, he was manager of the intaglio shop and would no doubt have other workers working for him. But those names never appear. It always comes under Joshua Hodgetts.
Thanks, Dilwyn. That was very helpful. Any other questions from anybody?
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Please do, Pam.
I was fascinated to hear your description of Frederick Carder. So was he really a Black Country boy? Did did he have a real Black Country accent?
Absolutely. I mean, obviously it's a long time ago now, but I do remember that his American accent that he had was tinged still with Black Country.
Yeah.
I would hate to try to do a black, but I remember he said to me something like, "Which one am you?" He said, "Am you then? Which one?"
Oh yeah.
I'm you. Yeah.
Do you mean where do you come from, our lad?
with a strong black, with a strong American accent overlaying it.
Good Lord.
That's brilliant. It's brilliant that a man from that background went to America and created the Stew Ben, isn't it?
I was actually being taken by David Dalzell of Fostoria Glass from New York City, where I worked at Tiffany's. And he very kindly collected me, and we drove up first to Corning. And then we had a look around the Corning factory. And then I remember walking across this yard and being told by Dave Dalzell that I was going to meet Fred Carter. And going up this wooden outside staircase up to the upper part of this brick-built building, which was exactly identical to one we had back in the works ourselves. And going in, and there was that dusty, musty sort of thing with lots of dust and lots of shelves and half-finished pieces. I remember an enormous horse's head. I can still remember it. It stood about 2 feet high, this cast horse's head.
Yeah, lost wax.
And there he was standing at the back of in the gloaming in this cow coat, just as though he was in Brierley Hill.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Marvellous, marvellous. Anybody else for questions? I think, Master, you can do your conclusions if you're there.
Of course I'm here. David, thank you for a fascinating and extremely lucid journey through the history of your family firm, Stevens and Williams, later Royal Brierley Crystal. It was brilliantly delivered. You gave us a hugely professional presentation, almost the best we've seen on Zoom. A real master of IT you are.
That'll be the day.
It came across with such sort of warmth and feeling. And you displayed such lovely pieces to you. I love that cameo work, which clearly became unfashionable, but I think it's lovely that you produced. And there were a couple of little things that caught my eye as we went through. One was when you were showing of the early members of the family and how Williams became Stevens and Williams, you became Williams Thomas, I mean, and your, however many great she was, grandmother, I suppose, Annette Thomas, married into the Williams family, and I suddenly thought, what an amazing facial resemblance. You look exactly like her.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, really? Well, isn't that amazing?
It was really amazing. And the other thing that struck me was when the to-be Queen Elizabeth, Queen Mother Elizabeth, visited the factory. Was it your grandfather Joe, great-grandfather Joe?
It was my great-grandfather, yes.
Great-grandfather Joe.
Yes.
I was being a military man. I was rarely struck by the razor-sharp crease of his trousers.
Well, I don't know whether he ever served. I don't think he did, but he was a justice of the peace. He'd been high sheriff of the county, and those kind of things. So I'm sure that his appearance in front of royalty was an important matter to him.
It was absolutely spot on, and in so many of the other photographs, creases were clearly not the thing for trousers in those earlier days. It was brilliant. But thank you so much for a wonderful talk. You've held our attention, rapt attention for so long. And I thank you both on behalf of the glass sellers and on behalf of all those from our allied and friendly organizations who've joined us this evening for this wonderful presentation to us.
Yeah. Thank you, Master.
And thank you also, in conclusion, finally, to all those of you who have joined us. Record turnout this evening. And thank you as ever to Paul for laying it on. Thank you all.
Thank you, Master. As they would say up in your way, it was Boston, it. Some of you may understand what that was. Of course, occasions they would say, "Where do you all come from?" Our kid is great, eh? I would remind, we've got an interesting presentation next week. We're being entertained by the assistant to the Chamberlain, the assistant clerk to the Chamberlain's court from Guildhall, Laura Wilson, who is going to talk to us about famous women in the City of London. I'll send it out, and of course all the people that are online tonight, if you'd like to join us, you'd be more than welcome. It is quite fascinating, the history of some of the things that took place in the city, and most enjoyable. So thank you all very much for joining us tonight. It will be recorded and on our YouTube channel in the next few days once it's been edited, and I would wish you all a very happy evening and enjoy the weekend and the lovely sunny weather, which looks as though it's going to continue. Good night. God bless.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fantastic.